This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Welcome to Mind Love, episode 48. Today's episode is all about loneliness and connection.
If I have a part of me that I don't want to have be a part of me, what I can do is push it away with my conscious mind. That causes a split within my own consciousness. So to the degree that I am fragmented inside, I will feel lonelier.
Turn up your frequency with Mind Love. Bite-sized brain hacks for seekers, dreamers, and doers. It's time to give your mind a little love with your host, Melissa Monti.
First, Mind Love is a CastBox original. CastBox is the fastest growing, highest rated podcast app on both iOS and Android. And for good reason. The app is awesome. Personally, it's my favorite and where I listen to all of my podcasts. You can still listen to Mind Love wherever you get your podcasts, but I hope you'll give CastBox a try. Second, don't forget to subscribe on whatever podcast platform you're listening on, and leave a review if you can. Reviews really help to entice more amazing guests, plus it helps me grow the show, which ultimately helps me give more value to you guys. Loneliness sucks. As an only child, I've always felt a little bit lonely. People with siblings have that built-in ride or die person. You get in fights, you may not talk for a few days, but you're family. I realize there are exceptions to this, but a lot of my friends have some pretty enviable sibling relationships. When I was in my 20s and going through all of my shit, ignoring my past trauma, I was deeply lonely. The moment I was alone, it was as if I could feel my emptiness just throbbing throughout my body. Sometimes I would ugly cry so hard I would hyperventilate. So I tried to be around people as often as possible. My social habits were basically another form of numbing. It was part of the reason I tried to party my problems away. But somehow, the more people I surrounded myself with, the lonelier I felt. Were any of these people my real friends? If I was in a bind in the middle of the night, would somebody come pick me up? I couldn't even get someone to pick me up from the airport, and this was before Uber. To be fair, this is LA and that shit is marriage status. But loneliness is a real problem. Lonely people aren't just sadder. They're actually unhealthier. And they die younger. Loneliness raises stress levels, it impedes sleep, and it makes depression and anxiety worse. And the scariest part is, loneliness is becoming a bigger problem. Ironically, even though we're more connected than we've ever been through technology, in this physical realm right here, we're more disconnected than we've ever been. A really sad consequence of that is that America's suicide rate raised by 25% between 1999 and 2016. So if connecting people across the globe instantly isn't helping our loneliness, what can we do? Today we talk to Teal Swan. She's a popular and bold modern-day spiritual teacher and the author of several books, including the upcoming The Anatomy of Loneliness, How to Find Your Way Back to Connection. As a survivor of severe childhood abuse, Teal Swan knows loneliness and depression. But to make things more interesting, she was also born with a range of extrasensory abilities, including clairvoyance, clairsentience, and clairaudience. Today, she uses her extrasensory gifts, as well as her pretty extreme life experience, to inspire millions of people towards authenticity, freedom, and joy. 3 key things we will learn are what really causes loneliness, why we push away people that are close to us, and how to start healing to find real and lasting connection. Before we get started, I want to tell you about the best way to stay in your highest frequency between episodes. Thousands of listeners are loving my daily morning Mind Love emails. They're short daily reminders of your own beauty, magic, and power so you can start each day with your best mindset. Just go to mindlove.com and sign up right there on the homepage. Plus, you'll get some amazing free gifts when you do. First, you'll get a really cool free booklet of power lists based on proven methods from the most successful people in the world to automate your highest decisions. Plus, you'll get a free guided affirmation meditation. It's set with a binaural frequency known as the miracle tone, which is known to make you a magnet for love, health, and abundance. Then it's layered with affirmations to perfectly tune your frequency for transformation. Just go to mindlove.com to sign up. Or if you're out and about, just text the word morning to 33777. That's morning to 33777. And now it's time for Teal Swan. Let's start with a little background on you. How did you become a spiritual teacher?
Most people use the doorway of suffering to spiritual awakening, and I was no exception. So in my childhood, I experienced years of abuse and then ended up escaping from that abuse and having to put my life back together again. And I was born with spiritual abilities. That's the whole reason for the abuse. I was targeted by a cult who wanted to use it for their benefit. So when I escaped, I had convinced myself that I wanted nothing to do with spirituality at all. And I went in the direction of professional sports. But I realized there was a point at which you couldn't succeed at your sport unless you progressed mentally. And so you start to run into all the blockages, all of the inhibitory beliefs, and all of the unhealed trauma. And so it was like, well, you're going to have to heal in order to progress in your sport. So I started to open to the idea that maybe I need to embrace these abilities of mine instead of spend my life running away from them. And then my son was born, and he was born with what they call a crystal aura. It sounds really super new age, but it basically means his aura is prismatic and it doesn't have boundaries. So when he steps next to somebody else, it takes on the same color of that person's energy. And they're called the universal healers because of it. And I knew that aura already. So when I saw him come out with that aura, I cried for about 4 hours, thinking like, this kid's going to suffer just like I suffered, before I sort of pulled myself together and realized that there's no way I'm going to be able to teach him to embrace his gifts if I don't embrace mine. So instead of resisting it, I started to go into it instead and really use them. And I started seeing people for one-on-one sessions because I'm able to see a whole host of things that most people don't have conscious awareness of. And based off of the results I was getting there, I found that it was really, to my complete surprise, this was totally my jam. And I remember the first time that I had a session, and it was like I looked at the clock and realized it had been 6 hours. And to me, it felt like a half an hour. And I thought, my gosh, I must really like this. And then it was blowing my mind the way that what I knew based on these abilities, which really feel more like a disability, was really transforming the way that people could live. And it was then that I started to realize maybe all of this a curse. Maybe it's actually the reason I'm here. I started thinking, well, most people can't afford a one-on-one session. That's the reality. I mean, the majority of people who are like really struggling, they're lucky to be able to afford a book. But I thought, okay, well, if I get a book into a library, they can read that. So I wrote my first book. And then I thought, okay, every library has computers that even homeless people can log on to. So if I put YouTube videos out there answering these kinds of questions that people have about the universe, then maybe that works. And to say that it blew up is an understatement of the century.
That's amazing. I feel like something only really blows up when there's a giant need or desire for it, especially when it's coming from such a unique perspective. And you have a really unique perspective. You were born with spiritual gifts. So I'm curious about those. What does it feel like to be you? Do you see the world differently than other people?
The best way to describe my spiritual gifts to somebody is to actually explain them as a disability, which is the way that they are universally seen. So when the average human being comes down into the physical dimension, they plug into the mainframe of the 3D reality. So your sensory perception is designed to kind of plug you in the same way that somebody could go into a computer game, and then that was their reality. And my filters didn't work. And there's several reasons for that. One of it is that my mother had a different Rh blood factor than mine, and my nervous system was corroded upon before I was born. So my capacity to be fully plugged into 3D is not there. That's why it's universally considered a disability. But what that enables me to do is see pre-manifested reality. I'm not only plugged into the three-dimensional reality. So the best way for somebody to understand what I see is to take a shamanic medicine, for example. Something with DMT would do the best, where you start seeing everything in motion. Like I don't see any solid objects. Like if I look at a table, something that the majority of people would see as solid, it's literally just vibrating energy. So everything is moving, and it's like this giant vortexy type of a soup deal.
Oh my God. I have had some medicinal experiences, so I think I have an understanding, but wow, that must be so intense, like sensory overload all the time.
Yeah, I don't know the difference between the way that I see and the way other people see. The only reason that I can explain any of this to you is because I've had friends in my 20s who were like, not normal, Teal.
Yeah, too bad there's not a plant medicine for you to take to see what normal people would see, right?
From what they've drawn for me, it would be kind of like you stepping into an anime world because, I'm able to see through skin and all kinds of life path potentials. And so life for me is beyond 3D. So it would feel like you stepping into a two-dimensional reality. And it scares me, like the idea of that.
Well, what you see scares me, so I guess we're even on that one. But yeah, wow, that's just insane. So you have the ability to see life paths and see things that other people don't. And your content has blown up, as you've said. So are your spiritual gifts able to help you pick which topics to tackle next? Or basically help you see what's most needed in the world?
It kind of comes through me like a delivery, I have to be honest. Sometimes the idea occurs to me, but it's like when the idea occurs to me, it feels as if it's coming through me from somewhere else. It's sort of like, when a woman's in labor, she doesn't know what is going to come out of her. She just knows that she has to be in that process. And that's what it feels like. So it's like whatever next topic that I need to talk about happens through me. That's the best way to describe it.
Well, your current topic is loneliness. And that definitely seems fitting with everything going on in the world. It's interesting because as technology improves, in one way, we're more connected than we've ever been. Yet, in another, we're more cut off from real-world connection than we've ever been. There are hundreds of memes that illustrate a room full of people just staring at a screen. And look, I just used something that I find on my screen to illustrate this point. Oops. So, would you say that loneliness is getting worse? And do you think technology is connecting us or disconnecting us?
I think it's both. I think that technology is both a valuable tool for connection and the very mode of disconnection. So I'm really torn about it. My material would never get to people, and I have an entire group, for example, it's called Teal Tribe. It's like this whole group that follows my materials and tries to help each other with those practices. None of them would ever meet each other without the internet. But at the same time, what happens when you go to a restaurant? You sit there and you watch a whole family, each of which is on their cell phone. So it's doing both. And my main focus actually is not around technology and how that's isolating us today. My main focus is actually on the fact that it's our gravitation away from a community-based society that is creating that level of isolation that we're seeing today. Like the children of today have never had less resources. We've never had less connection. Even our grandparents' generation, the kids were running around. It wasn't like, this lockdown because of fear of child predators, for example. So even back then, when there was a single family household, if there wasn't any grandparents, they were running around in the streets playing together. Before that, it was you're living with your grandparents and extended family members. Before that, it was a village. Before that, it was tribe. So what I'm watching is that we're getting more and more and more and more and more and more isolated to the degree where now children don't have any resources at all. Like you're lucky if your parents are on board 24 hours a day, but no parent can do that. It's not possible. So what is a kid supposed to do when mom's not in a space to be there and dad's not in a space to be there? And honestly, there are no resources in school.
I watched this documentary on Netflix called Happy. It's really good. You guys should watch it. But they profiled different people from across the globe in search of what makes people truly happy. And the answers they found usually came back to simplicity and community. One man had barely anything by our standards, but the neighboring families would all get together for community meals. And it was mostly for necessity and for survival, but it's also what made them happy and made them feel like they weren't alone in the world. Another woman in Sweden had to find a way to support her kids after a divorce, and she moved into this communal living space, which are more common in Sweden. And everyone just contributed in some way. Some would watch the kids while the others worked. Others took care of specific meals throughout the week. Others contributed with whatever specific set of skills that they had. It honestly looked amazing, but I have always wanted to live in some sort of communal living place, or a compound even. It's like a running joke in my social circles. It just seems like, especially in the US, we're so accustomed to being cut off from one another. And that just seems like a healthier way to live to me.
And it's the way that I've chosen to live. We're going back towards that, by the way. The return to tribe, but without the shadows inherent in tribe, is where the human race is headed. And you're going to see more and more and more of those, thankfully, popping up. Europe is, of course, ahead of the wave as usual. So you're going to see a lot more of those. The buildings, for example, that enable a person to be part of an economic and a modern lifestyle, while at the same time going back to a tribal-based mindset, which is like the woman that you described in that film. I think it's the way that we're meant to be living. And honest to God, if you ask me what the best decision I ever made was in my life, it is to live communally.
Wow, you're right. We went from tribes to multifamily homes to single family homes, and now we're all living in studio apartments by ourselves. But even in tribal times, there must have been loneliness. Loneliness has always been there. It's mentioned in centuries-old poetry and probably on a wall in hieroglyphics somewhere. So what would you say is the root cause of loneliness? The answer when we come back. Before we go deep today, I want to give you a little gift, and I want to give it to you every single day. It's called the Morning Mind Love. I know how life can be. You're all fired up after an inspiring episode, and then a new day or a new challenge comes at you, and it's just hard to keep up that energy. Well, the Morning Mind Love is kind of like an oracle from your higher self to help you start each day with a positive focus. Plus, when you sign up, you get 2 free gifts, a 30-minute binaural meditation and 30 days of journaling prompts to help you remember who you truly are. And it's all completely free. So join over 9,000 people and go to mindlove.com to sign up or text the word morning to 33777. You know what's crazy? After all these years of hosting Mind Love and talking to some of the world's leading experts, one of the biggest eye-openers for me has been just how much our gut affects, well, everything. When my gut feels good, my mind feels clearer, my intuition is stronger, and I just feel more balanced. And that's why I'm excited about Zoe, a science-backed nutrition company that is totally changing how we understand our gut health. They've created the most scientifically advanced at-home gut test and built the world's largest microbiome database. So when you get your results, you're not getting generic advice. You're getting insights about your body that other companies just don't have the data to provide. There's also just so much misleading health information out there. Food companies even pay influencers to promote ultra-processed foods as healthy. And that's why I love that Zoe relies purely on science. Real science. The randomized controlled trial showed that participants were 4 times as likely to report better sleep and more energy, all thanks to the info from the largest microbiome database on the planet. So go to Zoe.com and find out what Zoe membership could do for you. And because you listen to Mind Love, you can use the exclusive code MINDLOVE10 to get 10% off membership. As a Zoe member, you'll get an at-home test kit and personalized nutrition program to help you make smarter food choices that support your gut. That's Zoe.com. Use MindLove10 at checkout. Trust your gut. Trust Zoe. So what would you say is the root cause of loneliness?
What causes loneliness is separation. If you understand that concept, everything else that I will describe in this interview will fit into that concept. You have to perceive yourself to be separate.
So how does that happen? In maybe a not so obvious example, why can there be 2 siblings who have similar experiences and live in the same household, and one is lonely while the other isn't?
Authenticity. In that particular scenario that you're telling me, it's authenticity. One is able to be themselves and the other is not able to be themselves. So they're basically distancing. They're not being seen. They're not being felt. They're not being understood.
So you clarified that in that situation, separation would happen because one person isn't able to live as their authentic self. But let's go deeper here, because it's not like someone just wakes up one day and consciously decides, I don't know how to be me anymore. So when does separation really begin? Is it usually triggered by something?
The story of separation happened way before a physical human life. It happened universally. So we need to see consciousness as not just something that is broadcast from a singular human being, but as a collective that belongs to everything in existence. So this table belongs to that collective consciousness. So does the tree outside. So do you. So do me. That collective consciousness, we're sort of like fragments within it. And the concept in general that was born within the universe of I, you can't think it without creating separation. Like the thought itself basically cracks the oneness. So when that thought was thought, and that's far before humans even existed, far before Earth itself existed, the concept of I was created. It's differentiation. There has to be a thing now at this point. There has to be a starting and an ending to something. That's a concept. It's not an actuality within the universe. Everything is thought. When that thought was designed in the first place, or thought, it acted like a cancer that basically began this division process. And now everything you see in existence, like I am not my computer from this perspective. I am not the table. I am not my friend. It's like a cancer cell that has divided. If the original cell was the oneness of source consciousness. So that separation that happened is the first basic pillar. And that perception of oneness, I should say not oneness, that perception of I makes it so that we perceive ourselves to be different to and separate from everything in existence. Now, for thousands of years, you've heard spiritual teachers, Buddha was the most famous, talking about this concept. That is not a new concept. But what we don't understand is that as a fractal of the universe, that same fragmentation process is occurring within us. So it is the separation that is occurring within the consciousness of a singular human that is causing such an intense feeling of loneliness. Here's why. If I have a part of me that I don't want to have be a part of me, what am I going to do about it? I can't take a hacksaw to my own body and cut it out of me, can I? What I can do is push it away with my conscious mind. That causes a split within my own consciousness. When I push something away, you see, I become separated also. And that very sensation of the separation registers as the emotional feeling of loneliness. So to the degree that I am fragmented inside, I will feel lonelier, lonelier, lonelier.
So you mentioned pillars, and you teach about these 3 pillars of loneliness. So are these pillars basically what make up loneliness?
It's the things that are holding it up. So if I'm in a state of complete and total loneliness, these pillars are like these giant Roman columns.
So then separation is the first pillar of loneliness. What are the other pillars that are holding loneliness up?
So the separation as a concept sort of sits in the middle with this platform. And then the other 2 lean in like this. So they're all supporting and feeding into the separation. But you got to bring the whole triad down. So that was the first pillar. Second pillar is shame, something that most people don't understand. And the third pillar is fear. To fear, we'll talk about fear because it's easier. Shame is less easy for people. To fear something, by definition, is to push something away from yourself. It is the exact opposite vibration of love. Most people think hate is the opposite of love. It's not. It's fear. So when I love something, I bring it in as part of myself. When I'm afraid of something, I push it away from myself. What did we say about separation? If I push something away from myself, I can't do that without pushing myself away too. It's the same concept of like I can't hit something without myself being hit too. So when I'm pushing something away, I isolate myself. So the more that we fear, the more isolated we are. There's a whole plethora of things you can do about fear, but let's talk about shame because it's the most misunderstood one of the 3 pillars. Shame is really the mechanism for fragmentation within an individual. Because what shame is, it's the pushing of oneself away. It's not oriented externally, it's oriented internally. So let's say that I'm 2 years old and I want to wear a specific color of boot. And my mother walks in the room and at that moment says, "Oh, that's ridiculous. We're not going to wear those kinds of things somewhere." And that feels like she's pushing me away. What I do, and this is a biological affective reaction, is I will see that aspect of me that I'm identified with. I like that piece of clothes, or I like my fashion sense. I'm going to notice that my mother is pushing that away. Now, I have a choice in this moment. It's not a conscious choice. Either I allow myself to be pushed away, or I try to dissociate from whatever is getting me pushed away. And in the human race, the human psychology, our entire survival is dependent upon other people. As adults, we forget this. But not only are we a group species, just like a deer, we're also 100 times worse off because we're not up and walking around and able to graze soon. It's like we are completely relationally dependent. If you don't have an adult around a child, it is dead. So our survival is about that closeness with the group. So if they react to a part of us like that, we will alienate ourselves from that part of ourselves. We'll make an enemy of whatever it is internally. So it's a biological affective reaction to push that part of ourselves away from us to try to endear ourselves to somebody in our life. But like I said, when I'm trying to distance myself from some aspect of me, I can't take a hacksaw and pull it off of me physically. So what happens when I look to push that part away from myself is I create an internal split. And we're doing that over and over and over. So you can imagine that, people who live in deep isolation because they live in deep shame, they had experiences in their childhood where it wasn't just one or two things. It's like nothing that they did could get them the approval or that sense of connection with their parent that they wanted. So they just made an enemy of this, that, this, And so they're literally fractured internally.
Okay, so shame used to just be a word for me. I used it interchangeably with guilt and regret. But then I read a book by Brené Brown called The Power of Vulnerability. It's a really, really good book, especially for anyone out there who is looking for that courage to tell your story or to live more authentically. But basically, Brené says that shame is the most powerful master emotion. It's the fear that we're not good enough. And shame corrodes that very part of us that believes we are capable of change. Here's a really good quote from that book. Shame, blame, disrespect, betrayal, and the withholding of affection damage the roots from which love grows. Love can only survive these injuries if they are acknowledged, healed, and rare. So, as you were saying, in the case of someone who's constantly shamed by someone in their life, especially their parents, the ones who are supposed to build them up in this life, love can't survive, and we end up feeling this deep pit of isolation. This all sounds pretty bleak. So, what do we do? How do we begin to move ourselves out of loneliness and toward connection?
Well, this is my most favorite subject, because the way that we've approached shame in the past is that you just have to have high enough self-esteem. But look at this. If you understand the mechanism of shame and how it internally fragments because it's you pushing a part of yourself away, what's the remedy? I want to ask that question because it's better almost when people come up with the answer. Because the answer is actually obvious if you think about the mechanism of fragmentation. If I'm lonely because I'm pushing a part of myself away, what's the resolution?
To reintegrate that part of yourself?
Exactly. Let's say that I made an enemy of my anger, because this is real common, especially in women. Anger is not okay, right? So I will push myself away from my anger, and it becomes subconscious, and it doesn't matter whether other people can tell that I'm angry. I have consciously dissociated from my anger. I hate this about myself. What I need to do is to bring it in, recognize it as part of myself, and basically love it. To love, is to take something as part of myself. I don't need to approve of it immediately. What I have to do is see that it's valid, important, and that its needs must be met, that I have no other option. I'm not going to get rid of this part of me.
Denying our negative emotions is common. I know I fell into that trap. A spiritual teacher told me, and I've talked about it on this show before, but that suffering is a gateway to deeper levels of your consciousness. So when you feel pain, allow yourself to feel it. Instead of ignoring it or numbing it, ask what there is to learn from it. Move through it instead of around it. And that makes sense to me because through all the trauma I experienced in my late teens and early 20s, I tried to ignore it. I tried to just brush it away. And most people around me, besides those really close to me, like my mom, thought I was just this happy party girl. But just like anything that goes ignored, it will find a way to make itself seen and felt. So suddenly, I found myself in this situation where I not only had an eating disorder that was controlling my life, I had an Adderall addiction that I couldn't imagine giving up. I was binge drinking every night, was doing party drugs, all the things. Seriously, I can clearly remember an instance where somebody handed me a pill, I swallowed it, and then I asked what it was. What the F, Melissa? And it wasn't until I hit my rock bottom that I didn't have the strength to numb anymore, ironically. It was almost like I felt so helpless that I had beaten myself down so much, I didn't have that little bit of extra strength to move around it anymore. I was forced to feel everything. And honestly, I still am. Things will come up, and I think to myself, well, wow, that obviously still needs processing. Here we go then. But I can't think of a time that I was clearly taught that. When you're just grazing the surface of self-help, it's easy to interpret the message as just smile and beat it with positivity. And it seems harmless, but for some, for me, it was dangerous. So why is this message so hard to find? Why do so many people seem to think that just putting on a smile and staying positive is the answer to all of their problems?
I have a term for this. I call it spiritual Novocaine. And this is probably why I don't get hired very often anymore to do talks with other teachers at these big expos. Because most of what is taught in the spiritual field is bypassing, and it's drugs. It's basically, don't get addicted to that thing that's bad for you. Get addicted to this thing that we can tell ourselves is good for us. It doesn't work for me because the majority of people, they walk in those rooms, they sit in those chairs, and for 2 hours, they're getting pumped full of, you can do this. Life is awesome. Everything's great. Do positive affirmations. And then it's like you let a person go back to their life and 10 seconds later, crash. And so what they do mentally is, I just have to go back in that room over and over and over and over and over. There is absolutely no change. It's spiritual Novocaine. We're not dealing with the wound. It's not a real popular opinion, but I think it's unethical if we're going to continue to feed people this complete BS. And unfortunately, deep healing is always in the direction of what is killing us. It's like the only way out of this is into it. And so that's my message over and over and over and over. And if you think about it, as it applies to loneliness, if these parts of yourself you're trying to get away from, let's say you've got a part of you that's just really, really angry. If that part, if you saw it as an individual person, which is what I'm encouraging people to do, by seeing these parts of yourself as internal Siamese twins, if you see that part of yourself as a person, all of the stuff you've been trying to do in the self-help industry, all you're trying to do with any addiction to any drug is just literally, get me away from this part, get me away. Now, of course, it's part of you. And so it feels that rejection. It feels that isolation. That loneliness will register in your own body. So by being willing to feel the feelings, by being willing to become conscious of this part, by being willing to say, okay, this part is valid, important, and has needs, obviously, that I haven't listened to, so I don't know how to meet them, you're actually closing the gap that was created by that separation. And genuine integration is the solution to loneliness. It's that I become one with this part, and then one with that part, and then one with this part, and there is no part of me that is separate. And you will see the external world alter in response to that.
Okay, so let's break this down. So the first step is feeling into it, acknowledging whatever negative emotion you may have, giving it validation, and saying, I'm feeling angry, and I'm sitting with that. What is it that I'm looking for?
What the anger wants to say to you. We have to become comfortable with the idea that every emotional state conveys some form of truth. So it's like every emotion that occurs within my body is sort of like a veneer that is sitting on the precipice or sitting over the top of whatever emotional message that we need to be getting from our own consciousness. So maybe anger is saying that wasn't right for me. Maybe, fear is saying I need this to be softer. There's any message. I can't even come up with good enough examples here because it's like all over the map what type of message your emotions want to be sharing. And those emotions represent a very important truth for part of your being. So like me, for example, I've got one part that loves to be on stage sometimes and one part that's like, I don't want to be on stage at all. So I can enhance the separation and therefore lack of healing within my being, forcing myself, despite those emotions, on stage. Or I can take 2 minutes before I get on stage to sink in the direction of the one that doesn't want to be on stage and see what kind of needs I can meet. I actually solved this one, even mentally. That part of me was like, I don't want to go on stage, so just imagine me being inside of your pocket while you're on stage. And that I actually created a way to go on stage, but be perfectly in alignment with it. Instead of be sitting there being eaten alive by the part of me that's like, don't look at me,
That's a good idea. I feel kind of similar to you. I actually get super energized when I go on stage, but I want to hole up like a hermit crab in networking situations 90% of the time. But we're multidimensional beings. We don't always fit into just one category, like just introverted or just talkative. Different situations or different people will bring different parts of us out. But can you go deeper into what is parts work? I assume it has to do with isolating parts of yourself to work on, but how exactly do we do this?
Well, you can do parts work by yourself. You can do parts work with somebody else. My favorite method is if you can get a friend, but it's got to be a friend that has no judgment whatsoever.
Well, that should be easy.
You can get a friend or a therapist. And my favorite way to do it is to set up two different locations so that the brain can create the intentional cognitive separation between one state of consciousness and another state of consciousness. So you set up two chairs, for example, or two places in the room, knowing that when you go into one place, you're going to literally just allow one part of you to take over your entire being. It's important for us to understand that unless we are dealing with a part that is in and of itself confused, which is actually more rare, we're usually dealing with like a full-blown polarity, then it will be very extremely polarized. So I gave you the example earlier. I've got the part of me that wants to be on stage, the part of me that doesn't want to be on stage. So if I'm doing parts work, I'll sit in one area of the room and I'll allow myself to almost be possessed by that part of me. And it's not about Teal anymore. It's not about the spiritual teacher. I'm only the part of me that doesn't want to be on stage. Now, this might look like a 3-year-old kid. I may let myself fall on the floor and be like, I don't want to go on stage. I don't like the way that people are looking at me. I hate the way I'm dressed. This is not, when you're doing parts work, it's not going to look evolved. I'll go completely into that one in order to understand as much as I can about its psychology, its consciousness, its thoughts, its feelings. And then I switch. So I go to the complete opposite side, the part that's like, no, I want to be on stage. This is what I love doing. It's ridiculous. I like being on stage better than I like not being on stage, So they usually look like very polarized aspects. Then I'll step into the middle. It's very important that we begin to develop an aware ego. The aware ego is the one that sits in the center of all of these polarities because it is both and it is neither. Most of us are so controlled by our individual parts that we're identified with that we aren't aware that we are everything. So developing that one that sits in the center is really critical because it can look at the truth in one aspect and the truth in the other aspect. And what it can do is find what I call the third element. It's not a compromise because compromise is BS. Compromise is you take a little pain and I'll take a little pain. Neither is actually happy and it breeds resentment. The third option is, well, looking at the needs of this part, how could we meet both needs at the same time of both of these parts? Sometimes what happens is you step into one part and it has some truth that the other part just needed to know and didn't have access to for it to jump on board, which I love when that happens. So by doing this back and forth and sitting in the middle, you're actually acting as your own relationship therapist, but to the relationship between two parts within you so that you can find the highest and best course of action for a person, for their parts, because the definition of internal peace is that internal harmony between these polarized aspects. When we're in hell, which most people are, is when we're acting in alignment with the one we're identified with, meaning consciously we want to be part of that, and we're to the expense of the needs of the opposite part. So people start to make choices that are really in alignment for themselves. They start to be completely authentic because we're not authentic. When we're in the state of fragmentation, you're not authentic. If somebody comes up to me and I'm identified with a part of me that's strong, I'm like, yeah, I'm totally fine by myself. I'm in denial of the part of me that needs people. So what happens when people start to do this process is they start to become much more authentic, which ironically looks much more dichotomous. It looks like I love it and I don't love it. I'm angry and I'm not angry. But it's difficult for people to go there because we don't like cognitive dissonance. People want, this is the answer.
Yeah, people do seem to love to label themselves. It's why horoscopes or even online personality quizzes go viral. Which Game of Thrones character are you? We actually discussed this in episode 43 around the topic of recovery, because I believe we have more power than we think we do. So for me personally, I wouldn't necessarily find it helpful to still be labeling myself an alcoholic 20 years after I've been sober. And it's the same that I feel about being a bulimic. They say that it's a lifetime disease, but nothing about owning the label bulimic feels helpful to me now in this stage. But people in AA and NA, including my own father, did find it helpful. It gives them a foundation to start with, and they can build from there. But now let me play my own devil's advocate, because recently knowing that I'm an introvert has been really helpful to me. When I'm at a networking event and I suddenly feel like I have to go find a nook and recharge, I know why, instead of just feeling like a failure at networking. But if I dig down to my true beliefs, I think that human nature is just too complex to label yourself as something forever. I believe that we not only have the capacity to change, but we also change over time naturally. I felt like an extrovert in my 20s. So maybe these labels are a tool, but maybe they're actually doing more harm than good. You know what I love about the start of a new year? It's kind of like opening a fresh notebook. 365 blank pages just waiting to be filled with your story. But sometimes we get stuck trying to write that story alone. Maybe there's a chapter you've been wanting to revise, or maybe you're just ready for a whole new plot twist in 2025. But here's what I've learned from my own journey with therapy. It's kind of like having an editorial partner for your life story. Someone who helps you see the patterns that you might have missed, who gives you the tools to write stronger chapters ahead. And that's why I'm so excited about BetterHelp. They've made therapy accessible and easy, serving over 5 million people worldwide. With over 30,000 credentialed therapists, each with different specialties, you can find someone who really gets your unique story. But what I love is how flexible it is. Everything is online, and you can easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost until you find the perfect fit. And it's not just for people that are dealing with major challenges. Therapy can help anyone become the best version of themselves. So write your story with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/mindlove today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/mindlove.
The natural growth process for a person is to consciously choose singularity. So it's to consciously say, I like coffee ice cream and I don't like chocolate ice cream. That's basically building what we call healthy boundaries, which is nothing more than self-definition. And some people haven't had that healthy step, and so they need to go through that later in life. But what you'll notice is after you develop that healthy sense of singularity, meaning through my free will, I choose what I like and am not, and blah, blah, blah. Where you see the progression of mankind going is towards, you know what? The more I know, the less I know. There is no way to pin myself down. So what you're going to notice, anybody who's on the spiritual path, is that everything becomes more uncertain, including your own identity. You'll stop saying, oh, I know who I am, even though ironically, you know yourself more than most people by far. You'll be the kind of person, you start to really know yourself when you start to look at people and say, I have no idea who I am, depends on the moment.
It's like Socrates said, that true wisdom comes from knowing that you know nothing at all. And I find that true. I actually dated somebody in my 20s who said that I was the most outgoing, shy person he knew. And I remember thinking, I can totally see where he gets that, but why am I so complicated?
When you say I'm complicated, all that means is I feel in pain because no one's understood me. So it's like in that is like a plea. Please understand me. Please understand me. All that suggests that you've been surrounded by people who don't put the energy in to try to understand you.
Ooh, yeah. At that time in my life, I would say that was especially true. Actually, that was a perpetuating theme through my childhood. But it is weird being an only child sometimes. At home, it's great. You're kind of the center of the tension. You feel like you have so much love. And then outside of your household, it's completely different. I remember just feeling like a wolf without a pack, trying to fit in. Just always trying to find those people who would stick with me through anything, like a sibling would do. Because best friends always find new best friends. Relationships break up. But I will say that that's been the greatest blessing of marriage for me. Having my person who accepts me for who I am. Always having a ride from the airport is pretty sweet too. But okay, here's something I've been pondering recently. I've noticed something in the last few years, and it might be since I've been off Adderall, but it also could be through my marriage progressing and that relationship just becoming more and more comfortable. But I've been noticing my inner child coming out more, just being a lot more playful and embodying that childlike personality sometimes. But it does feel like a part of me is coming out. So when parts of yourself do pop up and show themselves, what's up with that?
Okay, you ready for this?
I think so.
It's an unmet need. In your childhood, when you were super excited, what happened? When you were happy and when you were bubbly and when life seemed like carefree, what was the response you got?
Well, at home, it was great. But like I said, as an only child, it can feel like a totally different world in your household and out of your household. So I did have a lot of friends, but I can't count the amount of times that I was told I was too hyper. I remember one moment specifically where this girl named Gabrielle, your name will be seared into my shame till the day I die. Just kidding. That was a little overboard. She not only said I was too hyper in front of the entire classroom, she also followed it up with, "What is wrong with you?" I'm like, bitch, we're 6. We're all supposed to be hyper. But I just remember completely shutting down.
Okay, but to you, it didn't feel like hyper. It felt like I'm excited. And this is actually positive. There was a positive aspect of your being, which was the excitedness to be alive and that enthusiasm running through your body of what could I do now and what next. And this is all the stimulation. That's something that a child needs to be able to share. And it's very difficult for adults, especially, to share in that, because when a little kid is approaching them with that type of energy, or even another kid who's also not been allowed to be in that energy, it makes a person feel what they can access. So it's creating a situation and then that's no different than when somebody's super happy and around somebody who's just lost someone. Like, get away from me. So basically, what they do is they go into disapproval of your state. And that creates an unmet need in a person. And that unmet need is, I want somebody to be with me in my excitement. So that unmet need, of course, is coming out now in your adulthood. Because the way that I want to describe development within a human is like you're a little sapling, and the process of growth kind of happens like a tree. And if those needs aren't met, it doesn't grow. It continues to need those things. This is what's actually happening with people who we diagnose with borderline personality disorder, for example. They were never allowed the kind of validation that a child needs. They never had the degree of nurturing that they needed, especially when it comes to stability. They had incredibly unpredictable parents, usually mothers. So that unmet need makes it so that they almost need a mommy. And that's what it feels like to be in a relationship. And most people hate borderlines because it's like, what the hell? It's like, it doesn't matter what I try to tell you to do to fix yourself. You're just clinging on me like crazy. And then I get in trouble the second that I'm not there for you. So they're basically frozen in a 2-year-old state of like, help me, I need mommy. The way that we need to approach this is not to get that we're adults. It's to actually indulge the need. So the more that you can have somebody with you in that state and excited also, the more that you can have people around you give you the impression that that's a good state to be in, the more nourished that need's going to be.
Well, perfect. So now, in the thousands of times that women will hear from men that we are complicated, we can finally respond with, well, I'm just validating other valuable parts of myself, and you should probably too, because this level of simplicity just does not seem healthy. I want to touch on something that you were saying earlier. To clarify, when you have an adverse reaction to somebody, it's because they're mirroring a part of yourself that you're rejecting?
Yes.
Okay, so what is the healthiest way to deal with that? Should you take your space and address that part of yourself and then try to come back together? Or is it better to try to work through it and push yourself to be more exposed to it?
Okay, the universe doesn't differentiate between the internal and the external world. That's why at a certain point, there's no point talking about self-love. There is nothing else. If we're going to accept the concept of oneness as the ultimate truth of this universe, which we need to, then there is no difference between loving somebody else and loving yourself. So there's no difference between doing internal work on the part inside you or external work on that mirror image. So it doesn't matter whether you're working on releasing resistance with the person or internally. My preferred route, always, is to go find the part of me that I have rejected that they are the external mirror of, and do work there before I really engage with the person. And even then, sometimes you'll engage with that part, and what you find out by virtue of doing that is maybe that the best choice is to physically walk away. But what's interesting is, and this is a lot of why you'll see genuinely enlightened beings, they do a lot of things that most people don't get. Like Buddha, for example, was pretty famous for this incident where he threw somebody overboard off of a boat to his death. Nobody understood this. Of course, he's like, how could somebody who teaches these principles do that? But I myself have even had scenarios where it's obvious that the only way to bring a part to connection is to allow it to choose complete autonomy and isolation. So there may be a time where to love something the most is to allow it to move away. And even that becomes obvious.
What if you're on the receiving end and someone is pushing you away? Because in that scenario, you don't have the power to go work on yourself and then come back. And I doubt that it would be well received if you said, hey, you're actually just rejecting a part of yourself that I'm mirroring right now. Want to go work on that? So what can you do?
Can I just speak to the most common cause of this?
By all means.
The most common cause of this is trauma in childhood related to not being received. And that trauma is like a skipping CD, and we have a compulsion to repeat in order to remedy. That's basic psychology. That's not even, me coming in with all these high spiritual transcendental truths. This is the problem. Most people don't have conscious awareness of this. Most people, when you sit down and talk to them, they go, my parents were awesome. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter whether you have the best parents in the whole freaking world. We're still in the emotional dark age right now. And even society itself is set up so that parents can't prevent a child from experiencing trauma. If you're living in the emotional dark age, no parent I have ever shaken hands with knows how to emotionally coach their children.
Sorry, mamas. That's a pill to swallow.
This doesn't make them the bad guy, but it's the reality that trauma is there. So I'll give you just a mundane situation. Let's say that a little kid's super excited because they just found a frog in the front driveway, and they run inside with that frog. They're in this open space of like, and what does mom do? Oh my God, get that thing out of the house. That's a trauma relative to not being received. It's just a minor example. A more extreme version of this, which is more common, is that you got a dad who's a workaholic.
Oop, Dad, we're coming for you now.
And you got a little girl who's basically like, please, please, play with me, please, play with me. And he's basically constantly playing the emotional avoidance. Now, he doesn't know any better, and he's not treating his daughter like a wife, and probably treats his wife like that too. But so he's not there. So what the little daughter feels like is like she's always focused on him, and he's always got something more important to do. That creates an embedded trauma within a person's psychology. And so what happens is they gravitate towards their definition of love, which looks like that, but they're actually looking for resolution. So they will find people who push them away. And their hope is, if I can get that person who's pushing me away to not do it, that I have resolved my issue with mom or dad. This is entirely subconscious, so most people have no idea of this. So the best way to remedy that actually is to basically reclaiming the part of you that was traumatized. I have a whole process for this. It's called the completion process. So you use the trigger of that experience. So someone's pushing you away, right? And in that moment, it causes an emotional reaction in your body. And that shows up somatically. So you've got that crushing heart feeling. You've got the paralysis in your body, those types of sensations. You sink into the sensations and you use them actually like a wormhole that connect back to the memory that you don't even need to have conscious awareness of. For example, I'll put somebody into that and they will have no memory that that was what it felt like with dad, but they'll go back and they're like, oh, I kept trying to get his attention, but he was on the phone. And so there's this whole process that we can go through to actually create resolution with that original trauma that is creating this reflection in our adult life. And that's the process to use for that particular situation.
Well, I mean, you gave what you called a mundane example, but it's a real one that causes real damage. So as a parent, it just seems like there's so much pressure because that doesn't seem like it can be avoided.
It's like people are like, I want to talk parenting. I know I should be talking about parenting. It's a nightmare. I'm just going to be honest. I know that I should be like, oh, it's amazing. And we all know there are aspects of that. Like, let's stop kidding ourselves. As parents, it's like there are aspects of parenting that are freaking awesome. But let's also be honest. It's a freaking nightmare. And the more conscious that you get, the worse it gets. Because you can literally see them getting traumatized in the moment.
Oh my God. That is terrifying to think about. Well, you say the more conscious we are, the worse it feels. So what is it like with extrasensory abilities? You tell him to put his toys away and his aura turns black?
To the one hand, you've got situations where you can see that happening. And because you can see it happening and see the potential, you're able to change it. You can actually create the resolve right then and there. And then there's no embedded trauma. And then they don't line up with it in adult life. And that's an awesome moment. But there have been moments, and this is why most of my focus is on social change, is that there are many moments for a parent when you're conscious that you realize, oh my God, I can't not affect my child. Like there are moments where you see the impact that some of these things are making and you can't do anything about it even legally. So you have an option as a parent when you run into those moments where it's like, all right, I'm going to change society itself.
Mic drop. That's probably the most powerful reaction to a challenge I've ever heard in my life.
Well, sitting and being bummed is not my thing. It's not my MO, I wouldn't suggest that somebody, if that made them unhappy, would go do that. But I'm the kind of person where it's going to piss me off about 100 times more if I'm sitting upstairs mad that I can't change something than if I'm spending every day of my life until I'm dead trying to change it.
That's awesome. But yeah, I can see how it would be extra difficult for you. At least other parents can just ignore it until the therapy bill comes.
It's very hard to talk to parents for me because I do get it, you know. It's like at a certain point, if we really want to get over, we need to actually acknowledge what's happening here in childhood. It's what psychology actually did do, right? We're getting encoded in these first years of life, and that is the primary reason for our dysfunctional experiences in our adult life. So we have to go back there. That is the origin. Ignoring that is like somebody coming into emergency room with a compound fracture, and we're like, yeah, I don't know what's going on there, but maybe we should give them IVs. So we have to be looking there, but at the same time, I have this extreme mercy myself as a parent as well. To know that you had any hand in why your child is suffering, I'm barely strong enough for it most days.
I guess that's the power of community then. We all feel barely strong enough for a lot of what life hands us. So how can we help each other? Because all of us have varying degrees of loneliness. Maybe parts of ourselves that we don't feel are quite as accepted. So for those that we're in a relationship with or that we're closest to, how can we begin to help heal each other's loneliness?
First and foremost is we have to walk in on an authentic foot. And I know that sounds like more self-help BS, but it's no freaking joke. If I walk into this circumstance pretending to be anything other than who I am or playing up one aspect of me, I am literally setting myself up to be lonely. So I have big emotions, right? So I'm the kind of person who I could never be close to somebody who was threatened by emotions. It's just not going to happen. So if I come into the relationship and I'm like, oh, let's put on my best face, I'm going to make sure that I don't have big emotions on this date. I am screwing myself. And so we almost like the first step that we need to take is to be brave enough to be vulnerable right off the bat so that we can disqualify people as soon as possible. Because the most pain that we experience actually is when we get really close, then we show our colors. And now we're like suffering the severing after we're already attached to a person. So one of the best moves I've ever made, and it's what I tell people who are in the dating process, is that you just go into it unapologetically exactly who you are, even if you're embarrassed of it. Like make a point of talking about what you're embarrassed of on those first few dates, because you want to vet people, believe me. And it's been so freeing.
We actually touched on this exact thing in episode 44, which was all about dating. But we talked about how people are so worried to just impress the other person that you pretend to be someone that you're not. So you're actually playing a character. But the problem with that is that then you're finding the perfect person for that character instead of finding the perfect person for your authentic self. You have to be you in order to attract the things that are right for you.
What I want people to understand is that if they do that, and lots of people are in the I need to be this way so that this person will love me mode, you will never be loved. It will never happen. It's not happening even when you think it's happening. They're falling in love with a mask. It's no different than like pretending to be some character in a film. They don't love you. So it's like we think we're going to get something we're never going to get. So what's the point?
I want to ask you about something else that we talked about in episode 44, because I just think that you have a unique insight. But one thing I've realized while being in a relationship is that when you're with somebody all the time, you discover parts of yourself that you didn't even know were there. And I'm still learning and growing and discovering parts of myself. And as we talked about earlier, I always will be. So how do you come into a relationship as authentically as possible if you don't fully know yourself yet?
Relationships are changing. In that years ago, the success of a relationship was all about how long it lasted, and it was never the case. It's not a measure of success whether a person is able to stay in a relationship for 80 years. People can stay in a relationship completely pretending to be something other than who they are and having a double life. That's what most of the people before the 1950s did. That's not a relationship. That's a living arrangement. What's really important for us, we can hold the intention of having a partner permanently. Most people, that's what they honestly want. I'm not saying that people can't get that, but what we have to become comfortable with is that you will, if you don't know yourself already, you will find yourself in the context of relationship. And by virtue of doing that, you may grow closer, or you may realize that you want completely different things. And so as a society, we've got to become a lot more pliable towards the concept that a good relationship is about the quality of the relationship, not the longevity.
You know, that's a really good point. A few of my friends have gotten divorces by now, being in my 30s and all. But a few of them have expressed feeling like a failure when that ends. But really, there should be a lot of gratitude there for the purpose it served. And if it wasn't making you happy, you're freeing up space for something that will make you happy. And people really aren't as good at hiding their dysfunction as they think they are. So you kind of just want to say, dude, you weren't fooling us. We could all see it. Now none of us have to deal with this anymore. Let's celebrate.
We got to start treating the relationships in our life, especially anybody who's feeling ashamed of where they are in their relationships. We got to start treating our relationships as if they are the mechanism for our own expansion, the mechanism for our growth, the mechanism for our awareness, the mechanism for our self-awareness that we're going to develop and happiness. So if we start to approach every relationship we step into as if that's what it's serving in our life, then it's going to be easier for us to let go of these societal expectations, which are outdated and really didn't have to do with anything other than property ownership. This outdated idea that I'm messing up in some way unless I can make this relationship perfect. It's not going to be. There is not a relationship on this planet that is going to be. Every relationship is going to force you to grow. And you're not meant to stay in every relationship, and that doesn't make you a failure.
That's a great way to look at it. Our relationships are mirrors. Our reality is a mirror for the internal. So really everything in this realm should be seen as a tool or a pathway for our evolving consciousness. Well, thank you so much for everything that you've shared today. For those listeners out there that just feel like this message is resonating, tell us about your upcoming book.
The book that I'm releasing is The Anatomy of Loneliness. So as we've described a little bit in this little session that we've been doing, this book breaks down what creates loneliness, like the actual anatomy of it, so that you can understand loneliness completely so as to topple those pillars that I'm describing. So I'm not just telling you what's creating loneliness. I'm telling you, how do we pull down those pillars so that we're no longer lonely? Now that those pillars have pulled down, the second half of the book is about how to create connection, and connection that lasts, because it's what most people want. Most of us don't want to get super attached to somebody and then be like, well, bye, that was a nice time. I break down for people how to do the opposite of what was creating the loneliness. And I am partial to this book. I mean, I wrote it. I would hope that every author feels that way, but I'm obsessed with this book. I love it. I want to get it everywhere. I actually have a special offer for people who are watching today. If you pre-order and you send a receipt to gifts@tealswan.com, which is my website, you receive an audio book actually of the connection process, which is another process that I created. It's really fun, by the way. The connection process is an esoteric process for creating genuine intimacy with another person. Because what I'm explaining in this book is that each person has an internal universe. And what this process does is it teaches you how to go into that other person's internal universe. It's more intimacy than you've ever had in your life. And it's really super fun to do with another person. You can do it with yourself, but it's really fun to do with another person. So if you order the Anatomy of Loneliness, you get an audio version of that, like the second that you send your proof of purchase basically into the website.
All of the links mentioned in this episode are at mindlove.com/048, including a link to Teal's book, The Anatomy of Loneliness, on Amazon. I want to challenge you guys to be conscious of connecting with people this week. All we have is each other, and we're all just a mirror of fragments of one consciousness. So connect a little more than you usually do. Reach out to someone you haven't spoken to in a while. Be vulnerable. Find some laughter, learn something new. And I'll actually end on a lighter note of something that you can both learn from and laugh at. There's a new podcast that some of you may like. If you've ever watched a stand-up comedy special in Comedy Central or HBO and wondered, how did we get here? There's a new podcast about the history of American stand-up called The History of Stand-Up, obviously. It's a really interesting insight into the history of comedy from vaudeville all the way to Netflix. The History of Stand-Up is now out on CastBox, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. So if it sounds interesting, check it out. Again, head to mindlove.com/048 for all the links mentioned in this episode. You can support this show by supporting our sponsors. And if you're enjoying Mind Love, tell a friend, family member, or coworker about it. And don't forget to subscribe on CastBox or Apple Podcasts and rate and review on Apple Podcasts. Also, for some extra inspiration between episodes, don't forget to sign up for the Morning Mind Love at mindlove.com. Just text the word morning to 33777. Thanks for giving your mind a little love today, and I'll see you next week.
Thanks for tuning into Your Higher Frequency with Mind Love. Head to mindlove.com for a free gift to keep your vibes up until next week.